as European, provincial and federal negotiators gather in Ottawa for a third round of free trade talks, which have been progressing rapidly and very quietly until today. We feel that given the broad scope of the agreement and its many potential impacts on public policy in both Canada and the European Union, that it is unacceptable that the government has not decided to make this a national debate, to include as many voices as possible and to question whether in fact another free trade deal is what the world really needs in these times of economic, climate and social crises. Before I get to the documents we are releasing, I should say that this is a joint press conference of sorts. I will speak for the first part, and then on behalf of the Trade Justice Network, and then Scott Sinclair from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is here to release a report also related to these Canada-European trade negotiations. The Trade Justice Network is a group of environmental, labour, farmers, cultural and social justice organizations who came together this year because of serious concerns with the proposed Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. Several members are here today, as you can see. I'll introduce them at the end. So in your brown paper envelopes, you will see that you have received a copy of the January consolidated draft text of the CETA. There are also fact sheets on that disc put together by the Trade Justice Network that will help explain some of the effects of the agreement as written, some of the effects it could have on public policy. The CETA had already been called the most significant bilateral trade negotiation since NAFTA, and the first to involve the provinces in negotiations. This document confirms it. Controversial provisions in the draft text would open Canada's telecommunications sector to full foreign ownership, stop municipal governments from implementing local or ethical purchasing strategies, require a burdensome necessity test for prudential, financial, or banking measures that are designed to protect countries and consumers from the kinds of crashes that we saw globally economically in 2008. The text also presents a direct attack on Ontario's Green Energy Act, which includes popular and proven local content quotas with the intent of creating, fostering, and growing the local green energy industry. The intellectual property chapter would also virtually eliminate the rights of farmers to save, reuse, and sell seed, providing biotech, pharmaceutical, pesticide, seed, and grain companies powerful new tools to essentially decide who should farm and how. Canadian negotiators have also included a controversial investor-state dispute mechanism, like the one in NAFTA. The Chapter 11 dispute process has allowed and encouraged large multinationals to sue North American governments for compensation against public health and environmental policies that limit their corporate profits. Some recent examples include Dow AgroScience's lawsuit against Quebec's pesticide ban and Bilcon's challenge to an environmental assessment that blocked its quarry in Nova Scotia. According to a CCPA report in 2008, 40% of these investor-state challenges in NAFTA have been against public health and environmental policy. Europeans know Canada as a climate criminal thanks to Harper's mockery of the UN climate talks and shockingly weak commitments in Obama's voluntary Copenhagen Accord. Now we're offering Europe an expensive and damaging investment protection pact that could help bring their own climate and environmental commitments down to our sad level. None of these issues affect trade as most Canadians would understand it, and in fact tariffs are very low in Canada and in the EU. This agreement is about reaching behind borders, to restructure the Canadian and European economic landscape to make it more difficult to regulate corporate activity in the public interest. In that sense, it is hardly groundbreaking, but the same old corporate rights scheme that people, economists, and many governments are rejecting globally. The Trade Justice Network is releasing this text publicly to start a democratic debate about a comprehensive agreement with Europe. We need our cities to read this over and see where their powers and rights will be affected. We need provincial and federal opposition parties to challenge the scope and negotiating process of this agreement. Fundamentally, we need to ask ourselves if a NAFTA Plus agreement is the best solution to the new problems affecting our world, many of which were caused by exponential increases in production and trade. The network is also here to present a civil society declaration on the CETA, demands that we feel must be met before negotiations are allowed to proceed. These include, but are not limited to, a comprehensive impact assessment of the deal's potential impact on jobs, poverty, gender, human rights, farmers, culture, and the environment, fundamental protection for public services and an expansion of social policy, protection for the right to use public procurement as an economic development tool, and of the right to regulate in the public interest, based on the precautionary principle, a commitment to strengthen labor and environmental protections and make them as binding, if not more binding, than investor guarantees, and a recognition of the primacy of Indigenous rights over corporate rights in Indigenous lands, territories, and waters. We will be holding a series of public forums over the course of this week to raise more questions and to raise public awareness about this proposed trade deal, while official negotiations are taking place this week in Ottawa. The first will take place in Ottawa tonight, with guest speakers from Europe participating by Skype through video presentations due to volcanic ash grounding flights from Europe and potentially trade from Europe. A full copy of the consolidated draft negotiating text has been posted on the Trade Justice website. We encourage as many people as possible to visit www.tradejustice.ca to download the text, take it to their elected officials, and to start the national debate that our government and provincial governments have been trying to avoid.
I'm Scott Sinclair from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and I want to speak briefly to a study published today by CCPA based on these leaked documents. Now, first and foremost, you might wonder what is the need or the case for such an extensive agreement as we've seen leaked today. Trade between Canada and the European Union is already very open. There are very few traditional trade barriers, some exceptions, but not very many. So these talks are not fundamentally about trade or trade expansion. They're really about the role of government and driving domestic restructuring, particularly in Canada, because we are in all ways the weaker party in this negotiation. The EU is the dominant party in this negotiation. We've assembled a group of people here that speak to the breadth of concerns about this program of domestic reform driven through the guise of a trade and investment agreement. In my study, I focus on one of the European Union's top priorities, which is government procurement. Now, what the Europeans are seeking there is not so much open access to Canadian procurement markets, particularly at the sub-federal level, but unconditional access. European companies have access to Canadian provincial and local procurement markets on the same terms as everyone else and are quite successful in those markets. But what they want to eliminate is the ability for governments to, when they make public purchases of goods and services, to negotiate benefits on behalf of their citizens. And the most visible target of this, of course, is the Ontario Green Energy Act, which is the most innovative purchasing policy in Canada in a generation. In return for premium prices, for renewable energy, which will enable Ontario to hopefully phase out its coal-fired plants, companies, whatever their nationality, make commitments to local benefits. And there are provisions there for community control, all of which violate the text of this agreement. So again, even or especially in this area, this is not a treaty that is primarily concerned with trade. It is concerned with limiting the role of governments to regulate multinational investors and exporters. And that's true across a whole range of areas that our very distinguished group can speak to today. So it's, I think the Trade Justice Network has done a great service by finding and leaking this text at this stage in the negotiations. It's time that we have a national debate on the many fundamental changes from intellectual property to agriculture to manufacturing to public services that could be triggered by this treaty. Thank you.